I thought I should should start this talk today with a trigger warning. I will be using frequently a 9-letter word, which many Americans have found terrifying, ugly, or otherwise disturbing. So this is a warning to just, in case you are in that category, and if you find socialism a disturbing word, we have sedatives.
Don't vote for Bernie.
Okay. So I want us to think today about modern socialism. It is a product of the Industrial Revolution, about 200 years old. However, it may not be entirely a new idea. Advocates of socialism, advocates of modern socialism, are driven by a vision of social equality rather than class hierarchy. They are driven by values of cooperation rather than competition, and abundance rather than poverty. It is possible to argue that much earlier in human affairs, particularly during the Paleolithic era of hunting and gathering societies, what am I doing? Oh, yes.
I mean, on mine.
Well,
Try this one. Okay, whoops.
There we go.
there, okay. It is possible to argue that these gathering and hunting societies, such as that depicted in this slide, were socialist in some respect. They were socialist in the fact that these societies were highly egalitarian. They did not have sharp class divisions. There was a lot of sharing of what was produced, hunted, gathered, or fished. But it occurred in conditions that we would consider impoverished. So these have been termed sometimes as primitive socialism. What followed about 10,000 years ago was the beginnings of agriculture, and a little bit later, the beginnings of cities and states. These are societies that we know as civilizations. They had a sharp division of labor, as you can see here. There were farmers, there were herders, there were nobles, there were peasants, there were specialized artisans of all kinds, there were merchants and soldiers, and all of these civilizations over the last 5,000 years have had sharp class divisions, peasants and lords, rich and poor. And of course, they've also had massive gender inequality, creating societies that we now know as patriarchy. It was into this kind of society that the Industrial Revolution erupted about 200 years ago, maybe a little bit more. It began, of course, in Europe and North America, but it has become globalized in the 20th century. Now, the significance of the Industrial Revolution is immense. It is one of two major transformations that changed the conditions of life everywhere. The first one was agriculture, the second was industrialization. It meant massive urbanization. It generated a new kind of class conflict between the workers in the factories and the capitalist owners of those factories. This kind of industrialization strengthened European societies and enabled them to more or less dominate the world in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And perhaps, have a seat.
Sorry.
perhaps the chief significance of the Industrial Revolution, particularly as it relates to socialism, is that it meant that poverty was no longer necessary. It meant that human societies could produce enough, more than enough, for everybody to live a rich material life. Modern socialism, then, sought to recreate the equality and harmony of an imagined earlier time, but to do so in the context of the abundance of an industrial technology. So we can say that the socialist ideal had been practiced earlier, but it had been practiced in impoverished conditions. The Industrial Revolution changed all of that. Now, modern socialism can be thought of as a form of protest against aspects of the Industrial Revolution, especially its inequalities, its exploitation, and so on. And more recently, against its environmental impact. So let me say a word about early industrial societies to set the stage for socialism. The industrial cities were vastly overcrowded. They were smoky. They had terrible sanitation. There were frequent epidemics. There were few public services or public spaces. There was often inadequate water supplies, as is illustrated over there. By 1850, in England, the first country that experienced an industrial revolution, the average life expectancy was less than 40 years. In fact, it was less in 1850 than it had been some centuries earlier. The factory labor to which so many people were involved and were employed had long hours, low wages, child labor, as you can see here, monotonous work, heavy supervision, and harsh discipline. Eric Hobsbawm, who is a major historian of this early industrial age in Britain, said this about the early industrial society. Life was a stony desert, which the workers had to make habitable by their own efforts. Those efforts took a variety of turns. At the beginning, there were what are referred to as friendly societies. These are self-help working class groups that provided insurance against sickness, money for a decent funeral, and an occasion for social life in an otherwise pretty bleak environment. Another way that workers sought to address what was happening in the Industrial Revolution took shape in a movement that we now refer to as the Luddites. Ned Ludd was a mythical sort of figure who apparently began to destroy the machinery which was eliminating the jobs of skilled artisans. And so in the early 19th century in Great Britain, this movement took on widespread proportions as workers did organize to smash the machinery and burn the mills that were taking their jobs away. One of their songs rang like this: "These engines of mischief were sentenced to die by unanimous vote of the trade, and Ludd, who can all opposition deny, was the grand executioner made." You know, the British in the early 19th century sent more troops to crush the Luddites than they sent to Europe to fight Napoleon. And it was a brief movement. It only lasted a few years, but it was brutally put down. 60 or 80 of these so-called Luddites were publicly executed. It was a big deal for a time. Some workers acted within the political system joining movements that aimed at getting the vote for men. And gradually, during the second half of the 19th century, this was largely accomplished in most European countries. Trade unions were another means of protest against the abuses and the exploitation and inequalities of industrial life. They were legalized in England in 1824, and growing numbers of workers joined these unions as a way of increasing their wages and getting better working conditions. When they first started, they were considered extremely dangerous organizations by established society, although later on they became somewhat more respectable organizations. Now, within this framework, socialist ideas of various kinds began to circulate. One of them is what you might call communal socialism, of where small groups of workers would live and work together in a setting that where they and their families would be treated well. A fellow named Robert Owen, who was a leading industrialist, actually created one of these in Scotland at a place called New Lanark. He had a 10-hour workday, spacious housing, decent wages, education for children at his establishment in New Lanark, and you can see a couple of images of him. However, far and away, the most significant expression of socialism is connected with your friend and mine, Karl Marx. So here, a brief primer on Marxian socialism. Marx was German by birth, although he spent a lot of time in England, where he witnessed the brutal conditions of England's early industrial revolution. And he sat on a chair in the British Museum. I've never seen it, but I am told that it is still there. Marx complained endlessly about the boils on his rear end that were made worse by sitting endlessly in the British Museum and doing research on history and economics and writing his many works. Marx concluded from all of this, what he saw and what he researched. He concluded that industrial capitalism, as it was developing in Europe in the early to mid-19th century, was an inherently unstable system. It was doomed to collapse in a revolutionary upheaval of workers. It would give birth, that revolution would give birth to a classless society, ending forever the ancient division between the rich and the poor. Now, Marx's thinking on all of this was shaped by four major conditions of the times in which he lived. First, Marx was a child of the European Enlightenment. He believed in progress. He believed that societies can be changed, that they were not forever ordained by higher powers. Second, Marx was also a child of the French Revolution. Revolution had happened, and it had happened not long ago in France in 1789, and it could happen again, Marx thought. He had been vastly encouraged by the French Revolution and its reshaping of French society, and believed it could happen again. So Marx was a child of the French Revolution. He was also a child of the scientific revolution. Marx believed that he was a scientist. He referred to his socialism as scientific socialism. He believed that he had discovered through his historical research the laws of historical development that were just as sure, just as certain as Newton's laws of motion. So to Marx, socialism was not just a good idea, it was an inevitable outcome of the historical process whose workings he had uncovered. He also learned a lot from a colleague, Friedrich Engels, Engels was also the son of a German industrialist, but they had a lot of factories in England, and so Engels spent a lot of time in England, where he became acquainted with Marx and his good colleague. This is a brief extract from Engels' writings that says something about the industrial cities to which so many people were drawn. And I'll give you just a minute to read that. Now, it may be surprising to realize that Marx was wildly enthusiastic and positive about industrialization, about the technology of industrialization. This is what he wrote in the Communist Manifesto about industrial technology. The bourgeoisie, which is Marx's term for the capitalist class, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than all preceding generations together. Subjugation of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. Marx was a modernist. He believed in technological progress. He celebrated the Industrial Revolution because, and this was the thing that got him, industrial technology, as I mentioned before, had the potential to eliminate poverty, to eliminate inequality, to usher in abundance for all. And the fact that it was not doing that drove poor Marx crazy. He saw the possibility of a utopian society, but it was being constrained by the limitations of the capitalist economic system in which it had erupted. And so much of Marx's writing is devoted to his critique of the capitalist system, not of industrial technology. One of the leading critiques of the capitalist economy was its massive inequality and its continued widespread poverty when it was no longer technically necessary. Furthermore, he noticed the ups and downs of a capitalist economy, recessions, depressions, periods of boom and bust, the ups and downs of the market with which we, of course, are still familiar. He noticed the sharpness of the class conflict. I think it was Dickens, I'm not sure. Some literary figure of the 19th century referred to the class conflict as if it were people living on the moon, that they had almost no connection with the capitalist bourgeoisie. Furthermore, Marx noted famously that workers were alienated from their work, that they were mere cogs in a machine, that they could no longer take pride in what they were doing, as artisans had done for a long time. Furthermore, Marx noted that the capitalists pretty much controlled governments. They controlled the political system, the state, and they used its power to protect their own interests. And so for all of these reasons, Marx saw that capitalism was fatally flawed, that it was doomed to collapse, and amid a working class revolution, which was, in his view, on the horizon. Marx looked forward to a socialist future when the productive potential of industrial technology would be placed in service to the whole of society, not just to a handful of people. This would mean collective ownership of factories and land. It meant the end of the ancient division between the rich and the poor, And Marx even imagined that it would mean the end of state power altogether. Once socialism had been developed, there would be no more need for the state. Local groups of workers could organize the economy at a local and decentralized level. Now, this was a grand, compelling, prophetic, utopian vision of human freedom and community. It was a marvelous vision, and it inspired movements of workers to create socialist parties in all of the European countries. It inspired a large number of intellectuals, and all of this amid the grim harshness of Europe's industrialization in the second half of the 19th century. So socialists established parties in most European states. They linked them together in international organizations. These parties recruited members. They contested elections when it was possible to do so. They agitated for reforms, and in some cases, they plotted revolution. Now, the Marxist vision was expressed in song as well as in the drier tomes of Marx's writings. Have any of you tried to read Das Kapital? I tried while I was in graduate school. I didn't get very far. But the Internationale expresses in musical form and poetic form the Marxist vision of the future. Arise, ye prisoners of starvation. Arise, you wretched of the earth. For justice thunders condemnation. A better world's in birth. No more tradition's chains shall bind us. Arise, ye slaves, no more in thrall. The earth shall rise on new foundations. We have been not, we shall be all. The Marxist vision, yeah.
Which countries did it most influence besides obviously England, and did it have much of an influence on the United States or not really?
Yes, yes, but a little bit later. England was the first industrial society. It spread to Western Europe, France, Germany, Italy to some extent, less so to Spain, much later to Russia. And the United States really began industrializing in the 1820s, but it took off after the Civil War. The Marxist vision was also expressed in art. This is a pyramid of capitalist society. It was published in the United States, actually, in the early 20th century. And it shows clearly that the workers were at the foundation, supporting all of the others, supporting political leaders, supporting the religious establishment, supporting the military and police establishment, supporting the luxurious lives of the well-to-do, all of this on the back of the workers. This was a visual image of Marx's understanding of industrial society. Another dimension of the socialist vision was its internationalism. The picture on the far right came from an international socialist congress, and it shows workers from all over the world joining together. So it sought to counteract the growing nationalism of Western Europe at the time. But socialism was widely seen as a threat to the established order, which clearly it was. The image on the right there of socialism throttling the country. The socialism is seen as this devilish-looking monkey figure. And this is an interesting quote from Winston Churchill. which illustrates the way in which socialism was perceived. Now, Marx had predicted that the revolution would occur in the most advanced industrial countries. That meant England, France, Germany, Western Europe. But it did not. As it turned out, Marx had been wrong about a number of things. And so I wanted to raise the question of why Marx's predictions about a socialist revolution in the most advanced industrial countries did not occur. In the first place, and Marx did not see this coming, economic conditions did improve over time. By the end of the 19th century, the absolute misery of the early industrial era had been modified. It was nowhere close to equality, but the sheer misery had been changed. In part because there were political reforms. Marx believed that no government controlled by the capitalists could or would change things. On that, he was wrong, because reforms did take place. Unemployment compensation became, at least had a beginning. Sanitation efforts cleaned up the dirt of the cities, wages rose, misery eased for a fair number of people. Furthermore, and Marx hadn't seen this either, the democracy had some success. Men did get the vote, women not until the early 20th century, for the most part. Males got the vote and were able to put pressure on their political leaders to enact these kind of reforms. Another thing that Marx missed is changes in the class content. Marx predicted that industrial societies would polarize into two groups: a huge mass of impoverished workers on the bottom and a small number of very rich capitalists on the top. That was his vision of what was going to happen. He did not anticipate the growth of a middle class somewhere between these impoverished workers and the well-to-do upper class. And the other thing that Marx missed is the power of nationalism. He saw socialism as an international movement. And so there is this interesting question about why nationalism trumped socialism. The big example of this came on the eve of World War I. As World War I was breaking out, various socialist parties, especially the French one, called for socialists to refuse to take part. That socialists who were in the French and German parliaments were supposed to refuse to vote to finance the war. But they did not. The call of nationalism, of national unity, of fighting the national enemy, proved stronger than class solidarity. And so German industrial boys marched off to kill English industrial boys by the hundreds of thousands. I have pondered sometimes as to why nationalism became a more prominent loyalty than socialism. The socialist vision, in some respects, is a more powerful one, but it was not able to, tug at the heartstrings. Nationalism was able to. It's still a bit of a mystery to me, but the fact is that nationalism trumped socialism, and Marx had not foreseen this coming. As a result, in Western Europe, many socialist parties gradually abandoned any attempt at revolution, arguing for democratic socialism, arguing that it was possible to create socialism without a revolution, that through the democratic process, through political pressure, through gradual reforms, one could move in the socialist direction without a revolution. Edward Bernstein was a major figure in this movement at the end of the 19th century. Now there were variations. Russia, for one, was different. In Russia, there was no democracy. Russia remained autocratic, and so the only alternative for many socialists was revolution. And of course, as we know, the only place in Europe where a socialist revolution really did take place was in Russia. More about that in a little bit. The United States is also an interesting case in this situation. Okay, what I meant to show here is that both the Russian and Chinese revolutions occurred in places where Marx would never have predicted that they would happen. They occurred in places that were just barely beginning to industrialize, and in which the vast majority of the population were peasants in the rural areas, not workers in the cities. Now, the distinctiveness of the United States lies in the fact that no major socialist party took root in this country. In this respect, the United States is quite unique in the Western world. There was a socialist party. In 1912, it got 6% of the vote, and that was its high point when Eugene Debs was running for president in 1912. At the same time, in Germany, the Socialist Party was the largest party in the German parliament. So the question has arisen how to explain the relative weakness of a socialist tradition in this country. Let me suggest 3 or 4 things that might help to explain this. One was the frontier. If you were an oppressed worker in the East, you could go west, young man. So there was an escape valve. And the frontier provided a place where exploited or underprivileged people could go and start over again. And this, of course, was connected, the whole frontier notion was connected with this uniquely strong American version of individualism. And of course, the socialist vision is a collective vision, not so dependent on, in which the role of individuals was not quite so prominent. A second thing I think that inhibited socialism in this country was the ethnic and racial diversity. Massive immigration from all over the place, plus the legacy of slavery, meant that this country's lower classes were divided in any number of ways. It made it much more difficult to come together as a common exploited group and an exploited working class group aiming your ammunition at the capitalists. It was easier to say it's the damn Jews, it's the Irish, it's the Italians, it's the blacks that are causing my problems. Furthermore, American unions, when they got started, were relatively conservative. The AFL focused primarily on skilled labor and was not aligned with any major political party directly. Furthermore, during the second half of the 19th century, and especially after the Civil War, American economic growth was very rapid. Land was cheap, home ownership was available even to workers. And so for all of these and perhaps other reasons, socialism became uniquely a dirty word in American political life. and came to be considered almost un-American. And of course, all of this became clear during the McCarthy era in the 1950s. Despite this, there were elements of what you might call welfare state socialism that got enacted during the Depression under FDR. Progressive taxation, social security, regulatory systems, but less complete than in other West European countries. For example, we still do not have a national healthcare system in this country. There has been a lot of unrest, a lot of political violence, a lot of protests. There were the populists and the progressives of the early 20th century, but not many socialists. And that is a distinctive feature of America's modern history. So let me stop here for just a minute. What I want to move on to is socialism when it came to power, particularly in Russia, what it meant. But are there any comments or questions about what we have addressed so far?
The religions of the world that respond to socialism.
Well, let me put it the other way first. Marxist socialism, of course, was highly critical of religion. Religion was, in Marxist terms, the opiate of the people. It kept them blinded to their oppression. It kept their attention focused on the next world rather than on their misery in this world. So conventional Christian religion did not engage much with Marxist socialism. There was a smaller movement that has been known as Christian socialism, arguing that the biblical story leads in the direction of a socialist economy. I used to have these arguments with my father, who was an ardent capitalist. I pointed out that in the book of Acts, it is recorded that the disciples got together and they shared everything equally. It almost reads like a Marxist tract. My father was not convinced, but the Orthodox Church in Russia was very opposed to socialism when it occurred. And of course, the socialists, put it mildly, clamped down on religion wherever they came to power. I remember in my first visit to the Soviet Union, going into a number of churches that had been converted into museums of atheism. So, sir.
Before World War I, you pondered why nationalism took predominance over socialism. I think it has something to do with maybe tribalism, which to me is a very strong innate power. And to me, it seems easier to touch into that tribalism with a nationalistic kind of fervor rather than socialism, which is a bit more, everybody, the whole world. That's a difficult tribe to get.
Yeah. But why can't your tribe be the entire working class?
Because, as I said, I think it's a little more difficult
Yeah.
to identify with an international entire working class
Yes,
than it is something that's right in front of you with a flag that's waving.
yes. Yeah. Suzanne?
Well,
My name's Andrew. I was thinking about the environmentalism. It adds along a socialist line, to define it away from capitalist exploitation of the environment and rather make it a humanist thing, the status quo.
Yeah.
Staying it as it is, an environmentalist, socialist idea, a true believer in the planet first.
Yes. I want to say a little more about that later, but let me say now that 19th century socialism had almost nothing to say about the environment. The pollution of the factories was considered a good thing. It was a sign of progress. And it hadn't gotten quite so bad. The pollution was more local rather than national or international, and consciousness of it was modest. But in the 20th century, especially toward the end of it, that all has changed.
Well, I wondered if the American transcendentalists were familiar with these movements, because the statements by Engels and Marx sound so much like Thoreau and Emerson on the value of work, of manual labor, the beauty of it, and trying to return to the land, but also in terms of education, they wanted the entire, they wanted the underclasses, the lower classes to have the value of education. But around work, they're
Okay. I honestly don't know whether the transcendentalists were aware of Marx. They were more in the early 19th century. Marxism really got going in the 1850s and later.
But they were active as intellectuals then. Thoreau and Emerson were, it would seem, the spirit seems so similar.
Okay, good.
Is it not so that in Western religion, primarily Western Europe and America, the religion was very aligned with the ruling class, right?
Yes.
The ruling people, as we saw in that pyramid.
Yeah.
That the religion was very high
Yes.
on that, so they were aligned with that, and of course they would not go for socialism, even though socialism has aspects of socialism that Jesus could have.
Yes.
That's what they did.
And of course, it wasn't only in Christian countries that religion allied with power, but pretty much everywhere. Yeah. Once religion became institutionalized, and particularly if it relied on some degree of government support, well then. Yeah.
Just a comment on your comment on the chessboard, the bishops are whispering in the ears of the king and the queen. So that came to mind. But the thing about nationalism, it seems, seeing how it's worked in the past, it was a way of connecting for survival of against another force that was wanting to conquer the world. So becoming nationalistic, you were able to work together, as it were.
And I read somewhere once that nationalism was able to grab a hold of family values, of a connection to family, better than the socialists were. The socialists did talk in family terms, to talk about an international brotherhood of workers, but that didn't seem to cut as much mustard as the family of the nation, particularly if the nation could be defined in ethnic or racial terms.
What do you think religion was kind of, sorry, perhaps the reason that we didn't see a kind of eruption of socialism as much in the more industrialized countries was because religion had stuck to them for so long that it kind of also helped keep the upper class in power, like you see that throughout the kings in England and whatnot. And so because Russia wasn't as developed through their religion, they were more maybe susceptible to take over.
Well, I'd have to argue with you on that point. The Russians had a strong religious tradition. It was Christian. It was a different kind of Christianity than the Catholics or the Protestants. It was Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but it was very widespread, very powerful in Russia, and it was part of the established order. And so it was great. It was shocking when the communists came to power and really tried to stamp out religion. It was deeply shocking and deeply offensive to many Russians.
Yes, this question of nationalism triumphing over socialism, which reached its focus in World War I, where you see so many people going to slaughter, to be slaughtered, and fighting not really for their own self-interest, but for some ideal. It's quite a question, why did that play out that way? And one of the factors that occurs to me is the role of fear that was used as a propaganda tool of, the idea that this threat that really didn't exist but was trumped up by the propaganda of the people in power that allowed nationalism to win. I think Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, said if you get the people really afraid and then you wrap it in the flag, you could convince them of anything.
Yes. Yes. I would argue just a little bit about the question that they didn't know their own self-interest. I prefer to say that they defined their own self-interest differently than we wish they might have. And of course that persists. Yeah.
I know this is just your conjecture, but will you touch on which way you think the world or the globe will go in the future? More nationalist or socialist at the end of the lecture?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. Yeah. Although I'm a historian. Okay. So what happened when a socialist party captured the political system of a country? It happened, of course, first in Russia, and for reasons of time, I'm going to sort of limit my comments to Russia here. Socialism in power. The revolution was in 1917, in the middle of World War I, which was going badly for the Russians. What followed was 3 years of civil war. What followed that was about 8 years of the Soviets sorting out their leadership problem. But by the end of the 1920s, Stalin was firmly in power, and the task was building socialism. That was the Stalinist agenda, how to build socialism in one country. You see, this was the strange part. It had happened in a country where Marx had never expected it to happen, and it had not spread immediately to other countries, which Lenin had thought would happen. So how to build socialism in one country? That was the Stalinist agenda. What it meant, quite simply, was modernization and industrialization of a very backward country, but a distinctive kind of modernization, one that gave prominence to social equality and the promotion of cultural values of selflessness and collectivism. When I first went to Russia in 1988, I remember one time walking down the street and thinking something is missing here. And what was missing, I realized, was advertising. There was no commercial advertising. There were revolutionary slogans, support the revolution, support Gorbachev, that kind of thing. But there were no commercial advertising. Now, in the next 3 years, that changed dramatically in Russia. But this was the distinctive feature of Soviet socialism, the attempt to create a modern, industrial, affluent society, but to do so in a much more collectivist way. These two slides show these are Soviet posters. They show Soviet value placed on social equality. Here it is gender equality, over there it is ethnic and national equality, but equality was a major goal of Soviet socialism. Now,
New batteries, sorry.
I'm sorry?
It's got new batteries, so it's real sensitive.
Oh, okay, okay. Now, in the rural areas, what socialism meant in practice was the collectivization of agriculture, the abandonment of the private plots that peasants had owned and worked before into large collective farms that were much more efficient and at least in theory, could be more productive. This began to take place in the late 1920s throughout the 1930s. Peasants were forced, often against great resistance, to enter these collectives. Let's see, is that? Yeah, okay. This shows, it's a poster to celebrate the day of harvest and the collective farms. The poster on the left, on the right, shows what happened to the richer peasants. In Russian, they are known as kulaks. And Stalin thought that these richer peasants, who were just a little bit better off than the ordinary impoverished peasants, bore the germs of capitalism in the rural areas, and he wanted to get rid of them. So if you owned a shop, if you had a couple of cows that you were reluctant to contribute to the collective, you could be labeled as a kulak, and hundreds of thousands of these kulaks were expelled. They were sent to Siberia. A large number were just executed. And that poster shows, it says, expel the kulaks from the collective farm.
That's pretty Machiavellian.
Yes, it certainly is. In the cities, the major task was industrialization. But it was industrialization that took place under almost complete state control, unlike industrialization in the West, which was a product of private enterprise. What this meant in practice was centralized planning, a whole series of successive 5-year plans that outlined everything. What would be produced? Where would it be produced? Where would it be distributed? How much it would cost? All of this hammered out by a large bureaucracy. It also meant priority to heavy industry. There was a big debate about this. Some people in Stalin's circle favored a focus on consumer goods, shoes, and this sort of thing to enhance daily life. Stalin insisted that since Russia was surrounded by capitalist enemies, they had to focus on heavy industry, industry that could have a military application and that could protect the revolution. It also meant, industrialization also meant a massive mobilization of both the human and the material resources. And of course, it meant intrusive Communist Party control of the whole business. It was a very different kind of industrialization. And at least for a while, and depending on your point of view, it succeeded. During the 1930s, while the capitalist world was floundering amid massive depression, there was no unemployment in the Soviet Union. And they constructed the beginnings of an industrial society that proved itself in the victory of World War II. Nothing more impressively consolidated Stalin's power in Russia than that they won the Second World War. Yes, he was a bastard. Yes, he killed a lot of people unnecessarily, but we won the war. And would we have done it without him? So victory in World War II really consolidated Stalin's approach to the building of socialism. Furthermore, the Soviet Union achieved massive improvements in literacy and educational opportunities and allowed for much greater social mobility than ever before. Now, a question arises about socialism and totalitarianism. The Soviet Union developed a political system thoroughly dominated by the Communist Party. That party penetrated and controlled Soviet society in a way that Western scholars have defined as totalitarian, in which the state exercised an extreme degree of control over individuals and social groups. There were no other political parties allowed. The state controlled almost the entire economy. Political authorities ensured that the arts and education and the media conformed to approved ways of thinking. There were mass organizations for women, for workers, for students, for professional groups that were also controlled by the party and had none of the kind of independence that such organizations had in the the capitalist world. There was no independent Kiwanis Club, for example. There were things like the Kiwanis Club, but they were controlled by the party.
Did women and minority races have their rights elevated at that time?
Well,
I mean, to equality?
that was one of the premises on which the Communist Party was based, that they would treat all nationalities the same. And Russia, of course, was a huge multinational country. And so the idea was that membership in the Communist Party was open to everybody.
Brief interrupt. As I recall, however, on paper, the Soviet Union or Russia was extraordinarily democratic. I mean, I think they had their constitution goes all the way down to the street level that is supposed to go with people choosing their own leaders, and then they get the groups, and then it goes on up. Is that true, or something I remember falsely from my?
Yes, but there was little.
Yeah, they don't do it.
There was little opportunity for an alternative. I mean, any other political party was simply outlawed. It was forbidden. There was a kind of democracy within the Communist Party, but that leaves a lot out. Now,
You think that part of the reason that
a little louder, son.
do you think part of the reason the Communist Party is viewed so poorly in Western countries is, or viewed so poorly in general, in Russia and whatnot, is because the people who were writing it were Western countries? We don't actually know that much of what went on inside until very recently. And so, like, for instance, when you look at propaganda and whatnot, like Animal Farm and the way that things turned out and all propaganda, it was like, oh, how terrible this was. But perhaps maybe it's because our view was so warped.
Well, was it warped or was it accurate? There clearly was, especially in the United States, as I mentioned before, a strong prejudice against anything socialist. But when socialism in the Soviet Union turned into this kind of totalitarianism, then it even increased the anti-socialist attitudes. And the question arose, was it socialism that produced totalitarianism? The totalitarianism of the Soviet Union sort of came to a climax in the late 1930s, when there was a search for enemies of the revolution, enemies of the people, as they were called. The process culminated in the terror, the great purges of the late 1930s, which enveloped tens of thousands of prominent communists. Almost everybody associated with Lenin was ousted and executed. All of Lenin's associates perished in the Gulag or were executed. Between 1936 and 41, about 1 million people were executed in this terror, and another 4 or 5 million were sent to the Gulag, to those concentration camps. So, did the attempt to achieve socialism create a totalitarian society. That has been one of the chief critics of socialism. If you want a socialist society where everybody is equal, you will lose your freedom. Is it true? I think there are three answers to this question. One is yes. One is yes. That only coercion could sustain such a system and its utopian goals. That the goals of total equality were so utopian, so in some sense opposed to conventional ways of thinking, that they could only be ensured through outright force. That's one answer. A second answer is yes, but. Yes, but it was necessary at the time to ensure the preservation of the revolution. If you believed in the essential tenets of the revolution, you might very well say that it was worth losing one's personal individual freedom in order to preserve the social gains of the revolution. And a third argument is no, it was not socialism that led to totalitarianism. It was the attempt to realize socialism in an underdeveloped country. Would a socialist England have wound up in a totalitarian society? England had a democratic tradition. See, this is what Marx depended on. Marx thought that the countries with the most progressive political traditions and the most highly developed economies would be the most fertile grounds for a socialist society. And so the argument against socialism as being equated with totalitarianism is that it was the misfortune that the socialists came to power in a country that did not have any of the prerequisites for socialism. They were underdeveloped. They were encircled by potential enemies. They had to very quickly mobilize and focus on heavy industry in order to preserve the success of the revolution. It was these conditions, not socialism itself, that led to a totalitarian outcome. And furthermore, even within the Communist Party during the Stalin era, there were alternatives. There were people who argued in favor of a much slower movement toward industrialization, and one that is much more oriented toward consumer goods rather than the military. But Stalin was able to prevail because he could point to the hostility that was all around Russia. And if you want to preserve the revolution and all of its gains, this is the way to do it. Okay. How are we doing? Okay. I want to turn now to the failure of socialism in power. The late 20th century witnessed the failure of official socialism, or call it communism, if you like. This failure was expressed in three quite dramatic movements. The first occurred in China. Mao died in 1976. And after that, there took shape in China, as you know, I'm sure, a dramatic moving away from the policies of Mao Zedong to something now called a socialist market economy. It meant the introduction of essentially a capitalist system within a fairly heavily state-controlled political system. Mao, of course, would be turning in his grave. This is precisely what he had feared and predicted. And the fact that it was the Communist Party that introduced or reintroduced capitalist practices into China is quite an irony. Well, the second major event in the failure of socialism in power occurred in Eastern Europe, of course, in the miracle year of 1989, with the overthrow of many communist regimes. This, of course, is the fall of the Berlin Wall, which symbolizes all of that. And the third is the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. So these are three separate stories about the failure of socialism or communism in power. But behind these particular failures lay two general failures of the communist experiment. One was economic, the second was moral. Economics. There was no sign that the communist economies were catching up to the West. The highly regimented Soviet economy by the early 1980s was stagnant. That is, no growth. Lots of people standing in line, waiting for goods that often did not appear, and complaining endlessly about their poor quality and their declining availability. This was enormously embarrassing because it had been the boast of the communist leaders everywhere that they had found a better way to modern industrial life than the capitalists had. So this economic failure seriously undermined support for these regimes, certainly in Russia. The second obvious failure of the communist regimes was moral. The horrors of Stalin's terror, of the Gulag, of Mao's Cultural Revolution, of something approaching genocide in communist Cambodia, all of this wore away at the idea that communists had a moral superiority over capitalism. And this occurred as global political culture was embracing democracy and human rights as the legacy of humankind, not just as a product of the West. So in both economic and moral terms, the communist experiment seemed increasingly like a road to nowhere. It had reached a dead end. And then in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev's reform program further undermined the entire Soviet system. Glasnost, openness, publicity, exposed the ills of the system like crime, prostitution, suicide, elite corruption, Stalin's crimes. I was there during the late 1980s on a number of occasions, and it was just amazing what was happening. Every day, the newspapers would come out with more exposés of what had happened during the 1930s. Religion came back, along with other things. I remember walking down the street of St. Petersburg and seeing side by side with each other a stall selling religious literature, and right next door to it was one selling Swedish pornography. This was Glasnost. This was Glasnost. Here's how one poet put it: like an excited boy reads a note from his girlfriend, that is how we read the newspapers today. People would greet each other not by saying, "How are you?" but "What have you read?" Because books that had been what they called hidden in the drawer now were published to great acclaim. And the newspapers were pretty free and pretty open to a variety of opinions. And all of that undermined the foundations of the Soviet system. And the economic reforms that Gorbachev put into place spun the Soviet economy into a downward spiral. Inflation was rampant. Consumer goods were in short supply. Ration coupons, which had not been seen since World War II, came back. Many people feared the loss of their jobs. Prices, I remember watching as stores posted prices in chalk on a blackboard outside because they changed daily and always upward. Furthermore, the new freedoms that Gorbachev granted had demands that went far beyond what he had ever anticipated. There was a democracy movement that now sprang to life, advocating a multi-party democratic system for the Soviet Union. Independent labor unions appeared, which actually went on strike in the workers' state. There had been unions before, but they never went on strike. This was a workers' state, however. So how could workers go on strike against their own state? Nationalist movements used the new freedoms to insist on greater autonomy or even independence from the Soviet Union. And in the face of all of this, Gorbachev resolutely refused to use force to crush it. This was very different from what happened in China. You remember 1989 at Tiananmen Square, when the Chinese authorities violently crushed, before the TV cameras of the world, actually, this student movement that had many of the same goals that Soviet protesters were insisting on. This is an illustration of the nationalist movements. In the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, 2 million people formed a chain across their 3 countries, extending some 430 miles in 1989, calling for freedom and independence from the Soviet Union. And the climax came on Christmas Day, December 25th of 1991, when the red flag was lowered and the Russian flag was raised in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was no more. So its form of socialism had clearly failed, and the first Marxist country in the world was no longer that. Now, I just want to close by saying a few brief and very general words about socialism after communism. The first thing to say is that there is no enthusiasm anywhere for a Soviet-style socialism with state control of everything and the total end of private property. Nobody advocates for that these days. That is over. However, there is a considerable debate about the relative balance between the market and the state in running a major economy. And in that debate, there are some supporters of vigorous state action that have actually embraced the socialist label. Strangely enough, one of them is in the United States. Oops. Bernie in the United States and a fellow named Jeremy Corbyn in Great Britain have embraced the socialist ideal and have tried hard to sharply distinguish it from the communist practice of socialism. They refer to what they call unapologetic social democracy, or in the US context, the phrase liberalism with a spine has been used for people like Bernie, who are sort of left-wing liberals, certainly not advocating anything like a communist economic system. But these people who still embrace the socialist ideal have been exploring things like free free higher education, Medicare for all, a universal basic income. So some of these ideas are still percolating in socialist circles. In the media, I suppose that Paul Krugman is as close to this as you might find. Although he does not embrace the term socialism, but I think he is of this liberalism with a spine approach. On the other hand, socialism has also survived on the right as a boogeyman, as a way of describing pretty much everything that they are against. And almost any government intervention in the economy that would enhance the collective welfare is damned as being socialist. And of course, in doing this, they are drawing on the historical anti-communism, on the McCarthy era rhetoric that preceded it. And the final thing that I would say is that as environmental issues have become more prominent, sustainability has replaced socialism as a shorthand for the good society that we are seeking. So that the environmental movement has had an impact by moving us away from an explicitly socialist agenda to an agenda that addresses environmental issues. Sustainability has become, I think, sort of a shorthand term for the good society of people who might earlier have more enthusiastically identified as socialists. Now, whether we can prognosticate on this at the moment, it's a very difficult thing. There are obviously a lot of very positive things happening environmentally, but it's very difficult to see how this can occur in a quick enough fashion to actually address the climate crisis that is now upon us. So one has to work at optimism here. So let me stop here and see if you have any comments or questions.
Let me remind you that the mic does not magnify your voice, so make sure that you project for the audience here in the room. The mic is only for our online audience so they can hear your question, okay?
Your first slide indicated or showed the Neolithic society.
Yeah.
And
Paleolithic.
the Paleolithic, excuse me. But in those societies, there was always a headman or a headwoman, a priest, a shaman, medicine man, whatever you want. They were still stratified in those societies.
Well, there was a division of labor.
Yes,
Yes.
but there was also a hierarchy in those societies.
Well, some more than others, but relative to what came later with civilizations, they were highly egalitarian. You know.
Yeah, I think no discussion of socialism would be complete without, let's look at, well, we all have today mixed economies.
Yeah.
And considering the Norwegian, the Scandinavian countries who have a much more open to the to philosophies of the general good and support of the general good, many more benefits to their citizens than we allow because of their participation in socialism, and that would hold for all those countries up there.
Yes.
Can you say anything about those?
Well, that is the kind of thing that started in the late 19th century with this evolutionary socialism, or call it social democracy. And it has occurred in countries where there has been an already existing democratic system, so that these social welfare provisions came into existence democratically, not via any revolutionary effort. Whether that qualifies as a fully socialist society is a semantic question. But it is the most widespread form, I guess, of actual socialism today. A mixed economy that sort of tilts to the left in terms of its politics.
I went to Expo 67 in Montreal, and I have a vivid memory of the US, and I guess it was the Soviet pavilion or the Russian pavilion, but the US pavilion was a geodesic dome. It was fairly lighthearted. I thought, from my perspective as a native, that it was quite delightful. The Russian or Soviet pavilion was a massive, heavy thing full of tractors. But I do remember that they had a guest book, and that somebody had signed the guest book, and somebody from this country, and said, "This is wonderful. I'm embarrassed by the US pavilion."
Oh, okay.
Young man.
So you were saying that you believe that Marxism, kind of the foundations of it were built upon that the more advanced capitalist countries would take it on. So are you saying by that because Russia was less advanced because it just wasn't the ideal society to take on capitalism, that maybe if we had Great Britain or the US or even more advanced societies today take it on, that we may have ended up with a form of democratic socialism that was much less akin to the totalitarianism that ended up in the Soviet Union?
That's the argument of people who want to preserve the socialist option, that it wouldn't be the same.
One last comment about the environmental issues that we're facing, and that I have a feeling they could force us into almost back to tribalism just to survive in areas where it's been decimated. And then when you think tribalism, you think of a leadership. Some people are leaders, and people, they attach to them because they are good leaders. But the thing that's being left out, I think, is the respect for elders and their experience, whether they're a leader or not. And that might be where tribalism might work.
Well, you could also argue that the environmental crisis might demand action on a scale and with an urgency that only a coordinated government effort can make happen. And so in that sense, the environmental crisis might encourage people who have a socialist outlook.
Hello. Yes, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, and I think when you speak about the communist strength or socialist strength along those lines, in an environmental sensitive area, to have an environmentally sensitive place, it's like you said, it's going to take a coordinated, strong effort, and it's going to piss a lot of people off, and that's, and so, and the fact is, like when you speak of communism and totalitarianism and dictatorship, I think that evolves not just from communism, dictatorship, just from the Romans' loss of a republic to Caesar.
Okay.
Just like a weak democracy losing its strength and voting in a totalitarian gangster leader.
Yeah.
And
no names mentioned.
No names mentioned. But you see that in the collapse of Germany prior to World War II, the power of the personality coming in and telling you all the big lies that you believe.
Yeah.
And so, but change is going to be difficult, and you're going to upset a lot of apple carts.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
What is the next session on? We're gonna He's skipping the month of October, and then we'll do the first Saturday in November, and then that one is nationalism.
Nationalism is the first Saturday in November, and racism will be the first Saturday in December.
Okay.
Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
His name? I'll see you later.